Today we shift our focus to one of the more interesting civilizations of antiquity, the Etruscans. Our knowledge of the Etruscans has increased in recent years, but there are still some pretty large gaps in our understanding. Nonetheless, in this video what I hope to do is not only go over some of the major Etruscan cities, but also discuss Etruscan politics more generally and look at the distinctive cultural features of Etruscan civilization. So hopefully by the end of this video we will have accomplished all of those things, but again, as with all of these cities videos, this is by no means comprehensive. So let's begin at the beginning by talking about who the Etruscans are and where they came from. First off, the Etruscans never called themselves the Etruscans. So far as we can tell from their inscriptions, they had two different names for themselves. They either identified as the Rasenna or as the Rosni. The Greeks also were in contact with the Etruscans for a long period of time, and they referred to them as either the Tircinoi or the Tirinoi. This is where we derive the name of the Tyrrhenian Sea to the west of Italy. The Greeks started calling it that as a recognition that it was controlled when they discovered it by Etruscan ships. The name Etruscan comes to us from the Latins. They called these people either the Tusci or the Etrusci. This is also where we get the origin of the name Tuscany, which is the name of this region in today's Italy. A distinctive Etruscan culture only emerged around the 10th century and lasted down to the 1st century BCE. Then the Etruscans lost their independence to Rome over the course of the 3rd century BCE, but only gradually lost their culture afterwards. However, it's worth noting that the differences between Roman and Etruscan culture were never vast, but they were fairly different on a linguistic level. The Etruscans were neighbors with the Latin culture. Famously, the Latins, of course, are relatives of the Romans, the Ligurians, the Umbrians, and the Sabines. Since we have so little in the way of surviving Etruscan sources, most of what we know about their earliest history comes to us from ancient Greek and Roman sources who themselves largely rely upon speculation to try to get at where the Etruscans came from. We have three distinct ancient theories of Etruscan origins, which come to us from three different ancient authors writing over the span of about 7 or so centuries. Herodotus, from the 5th century BCE, speculated that the Etruscans migrated from Lydia and that they derived their name, the Tirinoi, from a prince of the Lydians who had lived about 400 years before his own time. Livy, who wrote approximately in the time of Augustus, claimed that the Etruscans had migrated from north of the Alps and that they were related to the Celts of the north. Dionysius of Halicarnassus speculated that the Etruscans were natives of Italy who had simply evolved in a different direction than their neighbors. Modern archaeology shows that Italy was more or less culturally uniform for a long period of time, from 2000 down to 900 BCE, effectively the entire Bronze Age and a bit beyond. This is known as the Villanovan culture. We see that all of Italy was effectively uniform. But then they began to take different directions. The Etruscans were distinctive from, say, the Umbrians or the Latins, and trying to explain that is somewhat difficult. Modern archaeology provides some support for all three of the ancient theories. So there is a good case to be made that much of the Etruscan civilization was due to native development, and then it was shaped and remolded by immigration from the east or perhaps from the north. One fascinating thing that we'll get into is that the Etruscans actually do not have an Indo-European language, and while we know their language, we're not able to find very many related languages to it, which doesn't really give us a good indication of where they might have come from. So most likely all three of the ancient ideas of Etruscan origins have some merit, but we simply don't know with absolute certainty how the Etruscans developed so differently than their neighbors. Clearly there was a combination of native development and immigration, however. Let's look at the Etruscan language in brief. Etruscan effectively borrowed the Greek alphabet and then adapted it for its own needs. The characters in Etruscan look a great deal more like the Latin characters that modern English speakers are more accustomed to. However, there are some key differences, and you can definitely see that They are related, however. That being said, Etruscan is a non-Indo-European language, meaning that the grammatical structure is not related to languages such as Greek and Latin, or say English, German, other Indo-European languages. And it's also unrelated to any other known language in Italy. In fact, there's only one related language to Etruscan that we're aware of at the moment, and that language was Limnian. This is from the Greek island of Lemnos, which had its own distinctive culture and language up until the 5th century BCE, when it was conquered by Miltiades of Athens. And then the language quickly died out, but fortunately there were some remnants there, and we know that the grammar is very similar to what the Etruscans had, and also there are some vocabulary similarities as well. This has led to a lot of theories about how each of these people got to where they were, but unfortunately we don't have enough information to really speak with a great deal of certainty on this. We have a pretty good sampling of Etruscan language. However, of the 11,000 surviving inscriptions, the majority are votive or funerary. Votive offerings, of course, are offerings to the gods, whereas funerary inscriptions are about dead people, which means that because most of these are in two very specific categories and in two very specific genres, a lot of the language is rather limited, so we have a lot of repetition among those 11,000 surviving inscriptions, and our understanding of Etruscan vocabulary is accordingly somewhat limited. There are a good number of terms for that reason which are still not understood due to a lack of context. So in more of the, say, political inscriptions, sometimes we find things we simply can't translate because we don't recognize the word and there are no cognates with other known languages. Many Etruscan words managed to work their way into Latin, and they stood out in that language because they came from a non-Indo-European language, so scholars at the time and since have been quite aware that these words were not Latin in origin. Some of the words which were passed on to the Romans and on to us include ace, arena, belt, market, military and all of its cognates, people and all of its cognates, spurious, vernacular, and window. Interesting story about window, the Latin word is fenestra, and that is where we get the underused but excellent English word defenestrate, which means to throw someone out of a window. The next time you get an opportunity to use the word defenestrate, you should definitely take it. When we look at the territory of the Etruscans and how they developed their cities, we see that there are some definite patterns and that there is a certain underlying cultural logic. The Etruscans situated all of their major centers on elevated plateaus surrounded by ravines, and then they would build sunken roads in those ravines. They'd also build bridges across some of the ravines and regular roads across the plains in order to connect all of their various major sites. Minor sites would lie along all of these various roads. So this is how the Etruscan world was connected, and most likely the Roman obsession with road building was inherited from their Etruscan neighbors. The major sites we'll be looking at in this video include Veii, Tarquinia, Vulci, Cerveteri, to use the modern word, Perugia, Marzabotto, and Clusium. One of the things that set Etruria apart from its neighbors is that it had a slightly different economic basis than some of the other regions of Italy. In South Italy, the Greeks relied very heavily upon agriculture, and that was fine and well for that region since agriculture in South Italy is exceptionally rich. Agriculture in Etruria is pretty good, but it's not quite as rich as that of South Italy or Sicily. So Etruria did produce quite a bit of its wealth through agriculture, but really the thing that set Etruria apart from its neighbors was its mineral wealth. And this is what really makes the Etruscans distinctive materially, because they have access to a great deal of metal that most of their neighbors simply didn't. The Etruscans had access to iron ore, copper, mercury, lignite, and marble, and all of these are still being mined today in modern Tuscany. Unfortunately, we don't have anything like a full picture of Etruscan politics or the nature of Etruscan government. We know a little bit about the evolution of Italian political institutions from the fragments of Cato's Origines, but we don't have anything like a full portrait. What we do know, mostly from Roman sources and a few inscriptions here and there, is that Etruscan society was highly aristocratic. In that sense, it was very similar to Rome, and that cities were often under monarchs. This too was similar to early Rome. Etruscan monarchs and their followings would sometimes leave Etruscan territory and then go conquer foreign lands and rule over them as a ruling class. This is something that happened to Rome early in its history. The 7 monarchs of Rome were all of Etruscan origin, and there is a reason for that. This also, as we'll see, affected at least one other major center in Italy. In the late 6th century, the last really prominent king of the Etruscans was Lars Porsena of Clusium, and he was someone who was renowned throughout the Etruscan world. After the Romans managed to oust their last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquinius turned to Lars Porsena for aid, and this led to a massive battle where the Romans effectively defended their independence from the Etruscan monarchs. After this point, Etruscan monarchy went in a steep decline, and by the end of the 6th century, most of the monarchies had fallen, just as the one in Rome had fallen, and those had given way to oligarchic republics very similar to what Rome had. These are effectively republics where rich people run for office, and while politics is very much constricted to the wealthy, there's still some degree of participation by the poor. We don't know a lot of details of how this worked outside of Rome, but Cato tells us that this occurred not only among the Etruscans, but also among many of the other cities of Italy, which suggests that Italian politics as a whole was relatively similar to Greek politics, at least during this period. So another thing to keep in mind is that just like with Greek politics, while there was a definite shift away from monarchy toward more representative oligarchical government, this does not mean that monarchies went away entirely, as some Etruscan cities continued to be ruled by monarchs. By the 6th century, the Etruscans began to enlarge their political organization, and they formed a league of 12 major cities. For whatever reason, although the membership of this league would change over time, it never exceeded 12 members. We're not exactly sure how this organization was run, how it was organized, or why it was limited to 12 members. Most likely, the limitation of the number of members was based on some unknown religious reason. The idea being perhaps that there are 12 Olympian gods, therefore there can only be 12 ruling cities in this league. We're also not entirely sure if there were junior members who didn't count as one of the 12, or exactly how that would work, but we do know at any rate that these leagues were rather exclusive. Over time, what happened to the league is that it would decline in cohesion, and the Romans were able to divide and conquer members of the league by conducting diplomacy with individual cities and using a divide and conquer strategy rather than making deals with the league organization as a whole. This was a common tactic to divide up leagues, and Rome was masterful at using divide and conquer tactics with their neighbors. Etruria ultimately produced 3 distinctive instantiations of the league. At some points it would temporarily disband only to reform with slightly different membership, but at any rate, just as with all of the people of Italy, the Etruscans were ultimately no match for Roman determination and human wave tactics. The human wave part is kind of a joke, but I just have to make sure that you know that, which kind of kills the joke. The 7th and 6th centuries BCE were the golden centuries of Etruscan civilization. It was during this time that the Etruscan cities reached their political and economic peak. It was only around 650 or so that the first Etruscan temples in the proper sense began to be built. Then, by 550 or so BCE, the temples will become fully mature. And it was at this time that they rose to a level of sophistication which rivaled that of the great Greek temples. It's also around this time, 550 to 500, give or take, when the art of haruspicy reached its full maturity. Etruscan haruspices continued to be sought out years after the fall of Etruscan civilization because the Romans came to believe that the Etruscan method of interpreting signs from the gods and reading livers was the correct one, and therefore the art of haruspicy would vastly outlive Etruscan civilization itself. Let's take a look at the Etruscan discipline. Let's consider the Etruscan discipline as it compares with the Greek and Mesopotamian methods of reading animal livers. One common way to ascertain the will of the gods was to sacrifice an animal and then inspect its liver. Usually the animal sacrificed would either be chickens or cows or something of that nature, and then someone would examine the liver for irregularities. There are some interesting similarities and differences between, say, the Etruscans, the Greeks, and the Mesopotamians, which give away some key elements of the culture of each one. Both the Greeks and Etruscans agreed that the caput or cephale, this being the Latin and the Greek word for head, was an important part of the liver. The Mesopotamians, however, didn't see it as significant at all. And if it was missing, this was considered to be extraordinarily bad luck for both the Greeks and the Etruscans. One key difference between the way that this discipline was practiced among the Etruscans as opposed to, say, the Athenians is that in Etruria, liver interpretation was a closely guarded secret and it was very much a profession. Haruspices were specialists who were trained in private religious colleges and did not share their secrets with others. In Athens, however, this kind of knowledge was widespread, and pretty much any citizen could practice this on behalf of the state, or on his own accord, and then go about the city and tell everyone else about what he had found through his sacrifice. That's a pretty major difference, and it shows the difference between a democratic society in Athens and a more aristocratic society in Etruria. Of course, as I mentioned in my video on Athens, they did have some inherited priesthoods, so Athenian religion was quite complicated in many ways, but when it came to interpreting the will of the gods, anyone was entitled to express his opinion on that. Another thing that Etruscan haruspices did that was fundamentally different than what some others did is that if you look at the way that Etruscan haruspices would read a liver, as opposed to, say, the Mesopotamians, you see that they did it in the reverse order. Etruscan haruspices would read the liver's regions clockwise. This is an Etruscan model where you see what they look for and what they're expecting to find. The Mesopotamians would categorize the regions a little bit differently and then read them in reverse order. So, while these differences are not huge, they were still seen as extraordinarily significant for the people who practiced them. And these kind of small differences would make all the difference in the minds of people who believed that these practices were legitimate and effective at interpreting the will of the gods. The Romans, for their part, were completely convinced that the Etruscans had it right and that everyone else had it wrong. So whenever they made sacrifices before battle, they would always employ the Etruscan discipline and typically relied upon actual Etruscans who were trained in this discipline and grew up and inherited their position and knew all of the various traditions about how to properly conduct and interpret a sacrifice. There has long been a great deal of speculation about the role of women in Minoan civilization, and most interpretations are based solely upon the visual evidence of the art, which shows women acting in equal capacities with men. Etruscan civilization is much more forthcoming about gender roles, however, and based on what we know from both art and from contemporary text, we can see that Etruscan women were probably the most free and empowered women of antiquity. In Etruscan art, men and women are acting as equals. They're typically posed in ways which give them an equal bearing, so the women are not acting in a subordinate fashion necessarily. Husbands and wives, when they appear together, appear as equals rather than as a master and subordinate. Greek and Roman sources also tend to portray Etruscan women as being able to act freely and also to choose their own partners. The way that they word it is simultaneously judgmental but also kind of admiring. Basically, a lot of Greek and Roman writers had very set ideas about what women should be able to do, so they disapproved of the practice because they thought that it bred degeneracy. At the same time, they clearly found Etruscan women to be attractive and alluring, since they knew that Etruscan women were different and therefore exotic when compared with what they were accustomed to. It's not altogether clear if Etruscan women actually were able to choose their own partners, or whether this is simply fancy on the part of foreign sources who didn't quite understand the culture. Suffice it to say, however, that it's clear that Etruscan women were more sexually liberated than their Greek and Roman counterparts. It's unlikely they chose their partners in their childbearing years, however, because there would always be concerns about the purity of bloodlines and ensuring the passing on of property. So most likely, if there was some sort of sexual liberation for women, it only applied to women who were past their childbearing years and didn't need to worry about producing legitimate offspring. Now, there has been some speculation of people who have taken this evidence and really run with it to the utmost extent, and I have to say that it is exceedingly unlikely that the Etruscans were a matriarchy. That being said, one's female ancestry might have played a major role in determining one's status, more so than in other civilizations. Up until the classical period in Athens, you didn't even have to have a citizen mother to be a citizen. So long as one of your parents was a citizen, that was good enough, and typically it was understood that the citizen parent was most likely going to be your father rather than your mother. So most likely women's status was taken more seriously among the Etruscans, but we still can't quite know with full certainty just because most of the testimony we have is from without, and again, it is somewhat hostile and also a little bit ignorant of the internal workings of Etruscan culture. Perhaps the most distinctive and well-known feature of Etruscan civilization are the tombs that they built for their deceased. Etruscan tombs preserve most of the material culture that we have from their civilization, particularly things like furniture, frescoes, and engravings of the human form. Etruscan tombs, for the most part, there is some variation, but for the most part tend to be fully furnished, much like houses. So much of what we think about the interiors of Etruscan homes comes from Etruscan tombs. It seems that each tomb would be loaded with grave goods that were intended to cover all of the needs of daily life. Before 750 BCE, warrior tombs would include terracotta arms, which were presumably ceremonial. They clearly couldn't be used for combat. After 750, however, tombs now started to incorporate two-wheeled chariots and real weapons. Tombs also have the best preserved frescoes of Etruscan life, and this is where we see men and women represented as equal, and we also get a lot of glimpses into perhaps religious ceremonies or celebrations. There are differences between the tombs of men and women, and this shows that gender roles and genderized working conditions were still very much normative for the Etruscans. Male graves would include tools and weapons, including, in the case of noblemen, the two-wheeled chariot, and female graves would include jewelry, spindle whorls, and spools for making cloth, which was a fairly universal women's activity across all of the ancient Mediterranean civilizations. Let's now do a brief exploration of some of the major sites of Etruria. First up is the city of Tarquinia. This Etruscan center claims Demaratus of Corinth as one of its founders. Apparently Demaratus came to the city early, brought with him some Greek women, and there was some intermarriage. Supposedly some of the later kings of Rome were descendants of Demaratus. The city was ringed by vast cemeteries, some of which have survived intact, and among these vast cemeteries are a number of important tombs. In fact, Tarquinia is almost certainly the richest Etruscan site that there is. There's the Tomb of the Bulls, which was built as early as 540, maybe down to 520. The Tomb of the Augurs, pictured here on your screen, was built around 530 or so, and this is an example of an early chamber tomb with wall paintings. Over time, what would happen with these tombs is that they started out as being divided into multiple small rooms, and later they would open up into just one large space. There's also the Tomb of Hunting and Fishing from around 510 to 500, and then the so-called Tomb of the Leopards from about 480 to 450 BCE. So these are some of the better known tombs in all of Etruscan civilization, and 4 of them are located conveniently close to one another at Tarquinia. Next up is the city of Vulci. This city was important in Rome's earliest history, since some of the early rulers of Rome actually came from this place. And it's also one of the better preserved archaeological sites in Italy today. It seems to have dropped off in the 5th century in terms of power, but by the end of the century it revived, and it did so just in time to become one of the major centers of opposition to Roman expansion. Over the course of the 4th century, Vulci recovered much of its power and glory, and it was one of the key leaders in the Etruscan League against Roman expansion, posing one of the greatest threats to Roman arms of any of the Etruscan cities. However, the Romans realized the threat that Vulci posed, so they cut off the city's access to the coast, presumably by planting a colony, and then the city would slowly wither away to obscurity under Roman rule. The Romans did not seem to patronize the site very much, and perhaps this is part of the reason why Vulci has survived as intact as it is, since it hasn't been built over extensively, as was the case with many other sites in Italy. Next up is the city that the Romans called Caere, but which is known in modern Italy as Cerveteri. This is an ancient city just a few miles from the sea, and at one point it was one of the largest and strongest of the Etruscan centers. The city was powerful enough that it had 3 different ports, all of them small, but nonetheless 3 ports, and 6 major temples that we have attested in our sources. Most of which, of course, have been lost, with the exception of some small fragments here and there. Caere boasts a number of rich tombs dating back as far as the late Villanovan period, say the 10th century, all the way through to the late Etruscan period, about maybe the 3rd century. So there is quite a bit of archaeological evidence here, and it also is one of the centers that people look at when they study the evolution from the Villanovans to the Etruscans. The most famous site which remains at Caere is the Tomb of the Reliefs, pictured here. This dates from the late 4th century, and one of the interesting things about the decor here is that rather than being done in fresco, as was the norm for the Etruscans, the decorations here are done in stucco. The later Roman writers Cato the Elder and Livy tell us that at one point the Etruscans controlled all of Italy. That is certainly an exaggeration, but it is not without some kernel of truth. One site that the Etruscans managed to conquer from their neighbors was the Umbrian city of Perugia. First recorded in sources as Perusia, Perugia was one of the 12 league cities which opposed Rome later on. So not only did the Etruscans conquer the city, but they also were able to secure it enough that it became one of the pillars of Etruscan civilization. Defeated by the Romans around 310, Perugia agreed to a 30-year truce. Because of its position in the far east of Etruria or the far west of Umbria, whichever pleases you more, it was effectively one of the paths through the Apennine Mountains, and therefore was strategically vital for any kind of opposition to Rome. If the Romans were to conquer it, it would effectively divide the Samnites in the east from the Etruscans in the west, and therefore it was a prime target for Roman expansion. During the Third Punic War, Rome's worst fears were finally realized when the Perugians, along with other Etruscans, coordinated a war with the Samnites. However, by this point, both sides had fought separately long enough to be weakened by Rome, which was ever growing stronger, and ultimately, despite having the right idea of forming a grand anti-Roman coalition, this coalition failed, and the Romans ended up conquering most of their enemies in the early decades of the 3rd century BCE. Just to put this in context, by 264 BCE, Rome had conquered every one of their Italian opponents, and that was the point at which they were able to then expand into Sicily and fight the Carthaginians. There was a Roman colony planted here during the 3rd century, and because of this colony and its continuous inhabitation over a long period of time, there are basically no Etruscan remains there at all, not to mention that there are no Umbrian foundations either. However, this does go to show you the extent of Etruscan civilization and how it did manage to expand outside of its own boundaries. In the north of Italy, the Etruscans planted the colony of Kainua. This was a site which held out against the Gauls who were native to the area until the 5th century. The Gauls then inhabited the site themselves, but were later driven out by the Romans, who declined to resettle the area with colonists. Because of this, Kainua remained more or less uninhabited until a later time period when it became the modern Italian city of Marzabotto. Marzabotto today is most associated with an SS massacre of local Italians, but as an Etruscan site, it bears a more interesting history, at least in my opinion. Here is a site of the city which, because of its lack of continuous habitation, is a little better preserved in its outline than most of the architectural sites that we've looked at. The ruins on the left are from a temple of Apollo. The Etruscan city of Clebson, which the Romans renamed Clusium and which modern Italians call Chiusi, is the subject of our next slide. Clebson, as an Etruscan center, joined the League of the Etruscans during the 6th century, and it was only under the leadership of Lars Porsena during the last decade of that century when Clebson would reach the peak of its influence. The only real Etruscan remains from Clebson are Etruscan-era Bucero ware. However, most of the Etruscan-era structures were destroyed and built over by Romans and other succeeding civilizations. So while the site at Clebson, Clusium, Chiusi is pretty architecturally rich, it doesn't necessarily yield all that much in terms of Etruscan remains. And I think that this is fairly emblematic of the situation in general, where you have some Etruscan origins here to be found, but for the most part the Roman replacements are much more prominently featured and available in the landscape. Last and certainly not least, we have the city of Veii, which is the nearest Etruscan neighbor to Rome. The Etruscan city of Veii was located along the Tiber River, perhaps 20 or so miles to the east of Rome, and because of its proximity to both Rome and the region of Latium, Veii would compete with Rome for domination over the region of Latium. Veii had a formidable citadel, and its terrain meant that it was able to resist Rome until 396 BCE. Its fall to the Romans was a major turning point in Roman history. It's worth speculating that the Romans actually considered for a time moving the city of Rome to Veii because they thought that Veii might be a better site. Thankfully, for the course of history, the Romans chose to remain where they were. Had they turned inland in that way, their history probably would have gone quite a bit differently. Veii had a number of important sanctuaries, and it was quite a prosperous city. There were sanctuaries to Minerva, Apollo, and other gods built mostly during the 7th century, then enhanced later, and a number of the fragments of these structures are now housed in a museum in Rome. The thing that you see on your screen was from the roof of a temple to Apollo, which was built by the Etruscans at Veii. The reasons for the decline of the Etruscans appear to have been a combination of a couple of major defeats and then a lack of internal cohesion among the members of the League. There are two defeats which are thought to really mark the beginning of Etruscan decline. The first of which is the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus from Rome around 510 BCE. Tarquinius went to his allies among the Etruscans, including Lars Porsena, and put together a coalition to try to reclaim his throne. The Romans met and defeated the Etruscan alliance in battle, and thus confirmed their independence, starting the early republic in grand fashion. It's also oddly parallel with the way that the Athenians throughout their ruling class, or at least their Pisistrate dynasty, then had to defeat the Boeotians and Spartans in order to secure their independence. So anyway, this was a sign that power was shifting away from Etruria, and the fact that the Etruscans gave up after one attempt to restore Tarquinius Superbus meant that they were not as well organized as perhaps their leagues may have looked on paper. The real event which probably played a bigger role in Etruscan decline, in fact, I know it must have due to the fall off in wealth after this defeat, was a battle in 474 between the Etruscan fleet against a Syracusan-led Greek coalition near the Greek colony at Cumae. This led effectively to the end of Etruscan naval power. The Etruscans apparently were also unable to afford to rebuild their fleet, and it looks like the cities of southern Etruria shriveled in terms of their wealth and even population after this defeat. This also meant that when it came to the struggle for the sea, it would be the Greeks versus the Carthaginians until the Romans became interested in naval affairs. So the Etruscans effectively were defeated in one grand battle and then gave up on the sea, and this effectively undermined their ability to collect wealth and be prosperous. Starting with the fall of Veii and then continuing through the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE with a pretty significant interruption due to the sack of Rome by the Gauls, the Romans would steadily conquer the Etruscans and their other Italian neighbors over the course of the 4th and 3rd centuries, finishing the job during the Third Samnite War in about 280 or so. The Romans were more or less content to allow local aristocrats to remain in control, and the local aristocrats would more or less continue to run their cities locally as they had always had, until the 1st century BCE, when they happened to cross someone who did not take kindly to opposition of any kind. And this was, of course, the Roman dictator Sulla. In the year 80, he decided to punish many Etruscan cities who had sided with either Marius or Cinna, his two great political opponents. And this effectively meant removing them from power, confiscating their estates, and handing over their property to Romans loyal to Sulla himself. Between 80 and 10 BCE, we see a rapid and unmistakable decline in Etruscan local identity. During this period, we see that there are many bilingual inscriptions which have both Etruscan and Latin, but after 10, we see that all of the inscriptions are simply in Latin, which means that the locals had given up on their ancestral language and that Etruscan effectively died out. We know that it died out not only in a public capacity but also in a private one, since many educated Roman historians would make what we now know to be mistakes when they tried to talk about the Etruscan language. Sometimes they would give a name, date, or define a word in a way which we now know to be incorrect. This means that there was not a great or deep knowledge of Etruscan history within a generation or two of 10 BCE. Another thing which has impeded our understanding of Etruscan history is the fact that the Romans who did write lengthy histories of Etruria, including the Emperor Claudius, all of those works have been lost. So we no longer have a lot of evidence about early or late Etruscan history. One interesting detail that the Romans did preserve for us, however, is that the Etruscan, presumably Haruspices or their predecessors, predicted early on in Etruscan history that their civilization would last 10 saecula. A saecula is not quite a century, it's more like the lifetime of the oldest person of any generation, so you could estimate that at anywhere from 80 to 100 years. And if you really think about when Etruscan civilization emerges archaeologically, say around 900, and then when it really disappears around 10 BCE, the Etruscans were pretty much spot on. At least assuming that this is true. Many prophecies are made up after the fact to make people look wiser than they really were. It's hard to say whether this was the case in this instance or not, but for the sake of fun, let's just allow the Etruscans this correct prediction and assume that they did foresee their own destruction and disappearance just when it happened. So that's all we have on the Etruscans, and after this we will then look at early Rome and explore its early development and what the city was like during the early Republic.